May 8, 1945, Hamburg, Germany, 11:42 a.m. The convoy rolled into the city through streets lined with rubble and silence. 3 lorries carrying British soldiers from the 7th Armoured Division, their engines coughing diesel smoke into air that already reeked of ash and sewage, and the sweet, sick smell of bodies still buried under collapsed buildings. The war in Europe had ended just hours earlier. Germany's unconditional surrender signed. Fighting ceased. The machinery of violence finally, mercifully stopped. But Hamburg did not know how to celebrate. Hamburg was starving. Lieutenant Colonel Peter Ashford stood in the lead vehicle and surveyed the destruction. The bombing campaign, Operation Gomorrah, had incinerated 40 square kilometres of the city centre 2 years earlier, creating a firestorm that killed 37,000 people in a single night. What remained was a landscape of jagged walls and empty window frames, streets reduced to narrow paths through mountains of brick, and everywhere, faces. Pale, hollow, watching from doorways and cellar entrances. Faces that did not cheer the liberators because they no longer had the energy to cheer. Ashford's orders were simple: establish command of the British occupation zone, assess infrastructure, and begin distributing emergency rations to prevent mass starvation. The third objective was the most urgent. Intelligence reports estimated that Hamburg's civilian population, swollen by refugees fleeing the Soviet advance, was consuming fewer than 800 calories per day. Malnutrition was universal. Children were dying at a rate of 50 per day. The convoy stopped at what had once been a school, now repurposed as a civilian assembly point. Ashford dismounted and was immediately surrounded by people, women mostly, and the elderly, and children with legs like sticks and bellies swollen with edema. They did not speak. They simply stood there, staring, waiting to see if the British had come to help or to punish. Ashford gave the order. His men began unloading crates marked with red crosses, tinned meat, powdered milk, hard biscuits, chocolate. Not much, barely enough to feed 100 people for a day, but it was something. The first something many of these people had seen in weeks. A woman stepped forward. She was maybe 30, though she looked 50. Hair grey, skin stretched tight over bone, hands trembling as she reached for a tin of corned beef. She took it, held it to her chest, and collapsed to her knees. Not fainting, not weakness, just the sudden, overwhelming release of tension that comes when you realise you are not going to watch your children starve to death today. She wept, and around her, others began weeping too. Not gratitude exactly, relief. The knowledge that the enemy they had been told would destroy them had instead brought food. They expected vengeance. They received rations. The starvation crisis in post-war Germany was not an accident. It was the predictable result of total war. Pursued to its logical conclusion, Germany's agricultural system had been disrupted by conscription, bombing, and the loss of eastern territories. Its transportation network, railways, bridges, ports, had been systematically destroyed by Allied air raids. Its food reserves had been exhausted feeding the Wehrmacht. And now, with the war over and 8 million German soldiers demobilized, the civilian population faced a simple arithmetic. There was not enough food, and there was no way to get more. The Allied occupation authorities faced a choice. They could enforce strict rationing and let nature take its course, a policy that would have resulted in mass death but would have avoided the moral complication of feeding the population that had supported the Nazi regime. Or they could intervene, diverting scarce resources to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe among people who, just days earlier, had been the enemy. The British chose intervention, not out of sentimentality but out of recognition that allowing millions to starve would create chaos, disease and political instability that would undermine the occupation and threaten the fragile peace. A directive issued by the Control Commission for Germany stated, "Emergency food relief is essential to maintain order and prevent epidemic. Failure to provide adequate nutrition will result in social collapse. Security, stability, pragmatism." The decision was made not because the Germans deserved mercy, but because the alternative was worse. CTA. If this moment already changed how you see the war, subscribe. The next will surprise you even more. Ashford's unit established a feeding station in the shell of what had once been a municipal building. The roof was gone, but 3 walls remained, and that was enough. They set up field kitchens, portable stoves that burned wood scavenged from the rubble, and began cooking soup. Thin soup, mostly water and a few vegetables and whatever meat they could spare. But it was hot and it was food, and people came. They came in lines that stretched for blocks. Women carrying infants, children leading younger siblings, old men who could barely walk. They waited for hours, silent and patient, because waiting was something they had become very good at. When they reached the front of the line, they were handed a tin cup filled with soup and a single piece of bread. They ate standing up, too hungry to sit, and then they left to make room for the next person. Ashford walked among them, observing. He was 42 years old, a career officer who had fought in North Africa and Normandy, who had seen enough death to fill several lifetimes. But this was different. This was not combat. This was the aftermath, the moment when you had to look at the people you had been killing for 6 years and decide what to do with them now that the killing had stopped. A little girl approached him. She was maybe 6, wearing a dress that had been patched so many times the original fabric was barely visible. She held out her empty cup and said, in German, "Bitte noch etwas?" Please, a little more. Ashford did not speak German fluently, but he understood the request. He looked at the cup. He looked at the girl's face, gaunt, hollow-eyed, the face of a child who had forgotten what it felt like to be full. He took the cup and walked to the field kitchen and ladled in another portion of soup. He handed it back to her and said, in English, "Slowly, don't make yourself sick." She did not understand the words, but she understood the gesture. She drank the soup slowly, carefully, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Then she looked up at him and whispered, "Danke." "Thank you." Ashford nodded. He felt something shift inside him. Not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition that the child in front of him was not responsible for the war, for the camps, for any of it. She was just a child who was hungry. And he had food. The equation was that simple. The feeding program expanded rapidly. Within a week, British forces had established 37 distribution points across Hamburg, serving over 100,000 meals per day. The logistics were staggering. Food had to be transported from British supply depots, prepared in field kitchens, and distributed in an orderly fashion to prevent riots. Medical personnel screened for cases of severe malnutrition and referred them to makeshift hospitals where they received intravenous fluids and specialized diets. The death rate began to fall. Slowly. Not enough to call it recovery. Children were still dying, people were still malnourished, but the curve had bent. The worst had been averted, and the German civilians who had been told for 12 years that the British were their mortal enemies found themselves dependent on those enemies for survival. The psychological impact was profound. Propaganda had promised that surrender would mean extermination, that the Allies would take vengeance for the war, that German women and children would be slaughtered or enslaved. Instead, they received soup. The dissonance was so complete that some refused to believe it. They suspected the food was poisoned, or that it was a trap designed to lure them into submission before the real punishment began. But hunger is a powerful teacher, and when you watch your child's ribs press against their skin, you stop caring about propaganda. A woman named Margaret, 34, mother of 3, widow since her husband died at Stalingrad, wrote in her diary, "The British soldier gave my daughter bread. He smiled at her. I do not understand. We were told they would kill us. Instead, they feed us. I do not know what to believe anymore." Not everyone accepted the help gracefully. There were incidents, civilians who spat at British soldiers, who refused to accept food from the enemy, who clung to the ideology that had sustained them through years of war and could not let go, even when letting go meant survival. Ashford encountered one such man outside a distribution point, a former Wehrmacht officer who stood with his arms crossed and his jaw clenched and refused to take a ration. "I will not beg from my enemies," the man said in accented English. Ashford looked at him. Then he looked at the children standing behind the man. 2 boys, maybe 8 and 10, skeletal and shivering. "This isn't about you," Ashford said quietly. "It's about them." The man's face hardened, but he took the ration. And as he walked away, Ashford heard him say something in German to his sons. He did not know what the words meant, but the tone was unmistakable. Shame. The British soldiers who ran the feeding stations were not social workers or humanitarians. They were combat troops who had been fighting for years and who harboured no illusions about the people they were now feeding. Many had liberated concentration camps and seen firsthand the results of Nazi atrocity. Many had lost friends to German bullets and bombs. They had every reason to hate, and yet they fed the children. Not because they forgave, not because they forgot, but because they understood on some fundamental level that starvation was not justice. That allowing children to die for the sins of their parents was not morality. That the war was over and continuing to wage it against civilians would make them no different from the regime they had defeated. A corporal named Davies from a village in Wales wrote to his mother, "We give them food and they cry. Some thank us, some look away in shame. I do not know if what we are doing is right. I only know that if we do not do it, they will die, and I have seen enough death." By June, the feeding programme had been supplemented by the arrival of supplies from the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, and the Red Cross. Rations increased, bread became more common. Milk powder arrived in bulk, allowing the distribution of fortified drinks to children suffering from rickets and scurvy. The crisis had not ended, but it had stabilised. Hamburg was no longer on the brink of collapse. Ashford's unit remained in the city for 3 months, overseeing the transition from emergency relief to a more permanent occupation infrastructure. During that time, he watched the city begin to breathe again. Not recovery. Hamburg was still a ruin. Still a place where people lived in cellars and scavenged for firewood and bartered cigarettes for potatoes. But it was alive. And that, Ashford realised, was something. One afternoon in late June, he returned to the feeding station where he had first met the little girl with the patched dress. She was there again, standing in line with her mother. When she saw him, she ran over and pressed something into his hand. A small wooden carving, crude but recognisable. A bird. "For Sie," she said. "For you." Ashford looked at the carving. Then he looked at the girl's mother, who nodded, embarrassed but insistent. "She made it herself," the mother said in halting English. "To say thank you." Ashford put the carving in his pocket. He did not know what to say. Thank you seemed inadequate. You're welcome seemed presumptuous. He settled for a nod and a faint smile, and the girl ran back to her mother, and Ashford stood there feeling the weight of the wooden bird against his chest. CTA. If you're seeing this war in a new light, subscribe. The next scene will challenge you even more. The moral complexity of feeding the enemy was not lost on British command. Letters arrived from home, from civilians who questioned why British rations were being diverted to Germany when food was still rationed in Britain itself. Why should we feed them, the letters asked, when they brought this on themselves? Why should we show mercy to the people who bombed London, who started the war, who built the camps? The answer, such as it was, lay not in morality, but in practicality. Allowing Germany to collapse into famine and disease would destabilise the entire continent. It would create breeding grounds for epidemics that could spread to Allied troops and neighbouring countries. It would generate political extremism, communism, fascism, or something worse that could reignite conflict. The decision to feed German civilians was not an act of charity. It was an investment in peace. But for the soldiers on the ground, the calculation was simpler. You either fed the children or you didn't. And most of them, when faced with that choice, fed the children. As the summer progressed, the relationship between occupiers and occupied began to shift. German civilians started working with British authorities, clearing rubble, repairing infrastructure, distributing rations to their neighbours. It was not collaboration exactly, it was survival. But it created a dynamic where Germans and British interacted daily, where familiarity began to erode the dehumanisation that had fuelled the war. Ashford observed this transformation with cautious optimism. He did not trust it. He knew that gratitude could be transactional, that people said what they needed to say to survive. But he also knew that every meal served, every child who did not starve, was a small act of defiance against the logic of total war. It was a choice to see the enemy as human. And that choice, repeated thousands of times across the ruins of Germany, was the foundation on which peace would be built. Fragile, imperfect, but real. In September, Ashford's unit was rotated out. They were replaced by occupation troops who would remain in Germany for years, overseeing reconstruction and the transition to civilian government. Ashford packed his kit, handed over his command, and prepared to return to England. On his final day in Hamburg, he walked through the city one last time. The feeding stations were still operating, now run by German volunteers under British supervision. The streets were still lined with rubble, but there were signs of life. Children playing in the ruins, markets where people bartered goods, a church holding services in a building with no roof. It was not much, but it was more than there had been in May. He stopped at the feeding station where he had first met the girl with the wooden bird. She was not there. He did not expect her to be. But her mother was, serving soup to a line of people who looked only slightly less gaunt than they had 4 months earlier. When she saw him, she stopped. She set down the ladle and walked over and said, in careful English, "You are leaving?" "Yes. Thank you," she said, "for my daughter. For all of us." Ashford did not know how to respond. He settled for, "I hope things get better." She nodded. Then she said quietly, "I'm ashamed of what we allowed, of what we did not stop. But I am also grateful. You did not have to help us. You did." Ashford looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "The war is over. We all have to live with what comes next." Ashford returned to England and resumed his career. He never spoke publicly about Hamburg, about the feeding stations, about the little girl with the wooden bird. It was simply something he had done, a duty performed in the chaotic aftermath of total war. But he kept the carving. He kept it on his desk for the rest of his life. A small reminder that mercy is not weakness, that the choice to help is always available, and that civilization is built one meal, one kindness, one decision at a time. By 1947, the food crisis in Germany had eased. The Marshall Plan brought massive aid, agriculture recovered, and the occupation authorities established stable distribution systems. The threat of mass starvation had passed, but the memory remained, both for the Germans who had been saved and for the British soldiers who had done the saving. Margaret, the widow who had written in her diary about not understanding why the British fed them, rebuilt her life. She found work as a nurse, raised her children, and eventually remarried. In the 1960s, she wrote a memoir about the post-war years. In it, she described the moment when a British soldier gave her daughter bread, and she realised that the enemy she had been taught to hate was capable of kindness. "I learned something that day," she wrote. "I learned that propaganda dies when it meets reality. They told us the British would destroy us. Instead, they saved us. And in saving us, they taught us that the world is more complicated than we had been told, that enemies can become something else, and that mercy is not a sign of weakness, but of strength." CTA. If this story moved you, subscribe, because the battles that define us aren't always fought with bullets, and the victories that last aren't always written in history books. The ruins of Hamburg have long since been cleared. The city has been rebuilt, modernised, transformed into a thriving port and cultural centre. The feeding stations are gone, their locations unmarked, their existence remembered only by those who were there. But the act of feeding, the decision made by British soldiers to see German civilians as human rather than as abstractions, as lives worth saving rather than as collateral damage, remains. It remains in the children who did not starve, who grew up and had children of their own. It remains in the gratitude passed down through generations, not uncritical, not naive, but real. It remains in the recognition that the end of a war is not a moment of triumph, but a moment of choice. The choice to continue the violence or to stop, to seek vengeance or to build something new. Ashford understood this. So did the soldiers who served under him. They had been sent to occupy a defeated enemy, and they had chosen, again and again, to feed rather than punish, to help rather than harm. It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was simply the recognition that children are not responsible for the crimes of their nations, and that allowing them to die serves no purpose except to perpetuate the cycle of suffering. The war had taught them to kill. The peace taught them to feed. And in that simple reversal, from destruction to sustenance, from enemy to neighbour, they discovered something that propaganda could never teach, that humanity is not a fixed thing, that it can survive even the worst violence, and that the choice to act with decency, even toward those who do not deserve it, is the choice that defines us. They expected vengeance. They received soup, and that contradiction, that moment when fear was met not with cruelty but with rations, when starvation was answered with food, became the foundation on which a new Europe would be built. Not perfect, not just, but survivable. The little girl with the wooden bird grew up. She had children. She had grandchildren. She told them the story of the British soldier who gave her bread when she was starving, who smiled at her when she had expected hatred. And in telling that story, she passed on a lesson more valuable than any propaganda, that even in the darkest moments, even when every reason exists to abandon hope, someone might still choose mercy. Someone might still choose to help. They braced for punishment. They received kindness instead. And in that gap, that space between expectation and reality, a generation learned that the enemy is not always what you are told, that mercy is not naive, and that the most important victories are measured not in territory gained or battles won, but in lives saved and futures preserved. The war taught them fear. A tin of soup taught them hope. And the British soldier who filled a child's cup again and again proved that civilization is not a grand monument, but a series of small acts, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, choosing decency when cruelty would be easier. They expected destruction. They found a wooden bird carved by a child's hands, offered in gratitude to the man who kept her alive. And that bird, carried home in a soldier's pocket, became a symbol of something the war had tried to destroy but could not. The stubborn, irrational human impulse to help, even when help is not deserved, even when every reason exists to turn away.